The morning the deal closed, I stood in the parking lot of my attorney's office and cried into my steering wheel for 10 minutes straight, not from sadness, from the kind of relief that comes after 31 years of getting up at 4 in the morning, of flour-dusted aprons and spreadsheets at midnight, of refinancing the house twice and swearing to my daughter that everything was going to be fine, even when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. $3.8 million. That's what Morrison Food Group paid for my bakeries. All 4 of them, every croissant tray and loyalty card and handwritten recipe I'd carried from my grandmother's kitchen into the world. I sat there with the check scanned into my phone and thought, my husband needs to know right now. He needs to hear this from me, in person, before I call anyone else. 26 years of marriage. He had watched me stress over those ovens and those leases and those impossible health inspections for most of our adult lives together. He deserved to be the first person I told. I texted my daughter on the way out of the parking lot. Big news. Call you tonight. I love you. Then I drove the 11 minutes to my husband's office building downtown, the whole way with the radio off, just sitting in the quiet of what my life had suddenly become. I should tell you about those bakeries, because they matter to this story in ways I didn't fully understand until much later. I started the first one, Marigold's, in 1993, 4 years before I married my husband. I was 29 years old, freshly out of a marriage that had lasted 18 months and left me with nothing except a very clear picture of who I did not want to be. I scraped together everything I had, borrowed the rest from my mother, and signed a lease on a 900 square foot space in a strip mall outside Columbus, Ohio. I made everything myself for the first 2 years. Every morning, every single one. By the time I met my husband at a neighborhood cookout in the summer of 1997, Marigold's was turning a real profit, and I was already eyeing a second location. He was charming and attentive, and he laughed at everything I said. He was a project manager at a mid-size engineering firm, steady and sensible, and I thought, this is the kind of man who will be good for me. Someone stable, someone who won't make everything harder. We were married in October of 1998. I kept the business in my name, not because I didn't trust him, but because my attorney at the time, a practical woman who had seen things, sat me down and said, Margaret, you built this before him. Keep it yours. I signed everything accordingly, and then didn't think about it again for 25 years. The second and third bakeries opened in 2004 and 2009, the fourth in 2017. By that point, my husband had risen to senior director at his firm. We had a daughter in her 20s living in Portland, and I thought our life looked more or less the way a good life was supposed to look. We went to dinner on Friday nights. We took a trip to Italy for our 20th anniversary. We argued about things like whose turn it was to call the plumber and whether we needed to repaint the deck. I did not know that for the past 4 years, my husband had been sleeping with a woman named Amber, who worked 2 floors below him. I didn't know any of it when I pulled into the visitor parking spot outside his office building on that Tuesday in March and walked through the lobby with my heart so full I could barely keep from grinning at the security guard. I took the elevator to the 8th floor. His assistant wasn't at her desk, she was probably at lunch. I walked down the hallway toward the corner office he'd had for the past 3 years, the one with the glass partition and the view of the river. I heard her before I saw anything. It wasn't the laugh, exactly. It was the intimacy in it. The way a laugh sounds when it belongs to someone who has nothing to hide, who is completely at ease, who has been in that room 100 times. I slowed down without deciding to. My body understood before my mind did. The door was cracked open 2 inches. I stood there in the hallway for what felt like a very long time, though I know it was only a few seconds. Because I am a practical person, and I have learned in 62 years of life that standing in hallways does not change what is happening on the other side of doors. So I pushed it open. My husband was sitting on the edge of his desk. A woman I had never seen before was standing close enough to him that her shoulder was against his chest. She was young, not shockingly young, maybe early 30s, but young in the way that registered immediately as a specific kind of cruelty. When the door swung open, they both turned, and the expression on my husband's face was something I had never seen in 26 years. It was not guilt, it was something further back than guilt. It was the face of a person being caught in a life he had stopped trying to hide, even from himself. "Margaret," he said. The woman stepped back. She had the decency to look at the floor. I stood in the doorway with my phone in my hand, and the biggest news of my professional life sitting unopened inside it, and I thought, I am not going to cry in this office. I thought it the way you think instructions when you're in shock, when the only thing available to you is the mechanical, the procedural. Do not cry. Do not raise your voice. Walk backward out of this room. I'll call you later, I said to my husband. And I left. I drove to Susan's house because Susan is my oldest friend and the only person I know who keeps bourbon in the house at 2 p.m. without it meaning anything troubling about her life. I sat at her kitchen table and I told her what I had walked into, and I told her about the check, and she poured me a glass and sat down across from me and said, "Honey, what are you going to do?" I didn't know yet. That was the honest answer. I had been married for 26 years, and I had just sold my life's work, and I had just seen my husband standing chest to shoulder with a woman in his office, and I did not yet know what any of those three things meant, together. He called 4 times before I answered. The 5th time, I picked up. "It's not what it looked like," he said, which is the thing people say when it is exactly what it looked like. "How long?" I asked. A pause. "Margaret, how long?" 4 years, he said. "But it's over. It's been over. She means nothing." I sat with that for a moment. 4 years. Our daughter's wedding had been 3 years ago, and he had stood at the front of that church with tears in his eyes while she walked down the aisle, and at the reception he had held my hand during the first dance and whispered, "Can you believe we made her?" And the whole time there had been a woman named Amber 2 floors below his office who knew things about my husband that I did not. "I'll come home tonight," he said. "We need to talk." "Okay," I said. And then, because I was still in shock, because 26 years of marriage is a thing that does not dissolve in an afternoon even when you want it to, because part of me was still trying to find the version of this story where it made sense, I said, "I have some news too. I closed the sale today. The bakeries." There was a silence I have replayed many times since. "The sale?" he said. "The Morrison deal?" "Yes." "How much?" And I told him. I told him the number. I have asked myself many times in the months since why I did that, why I handed him that information in the same breath as the worst afternoon of my life, and the only answer I have been able to arrive at is this. For 26 years, every piece of good news in my life had belonged to both of us. My instinct had not yet recalibrated. I told him because telling him was what I had driven to his office to do, and even discovering what I discovered could not immediately undo 26 years of that reflex. I regretted it by the time I hung up. He came home that night and he sat across from me at the kitchen table where we had sat for 1,000 ordinary evenings, and he said the things that people say, that he was sorry, that he had made a terrible mistake, that he loved me and he didn't want to lose me. He held my hands across the table and looked at me with his eyes full, and I thought about how I had believed, just that morning, that I was driving to his office to give him the best news of our shared life. I let him talk. I did not yell. I had decided on the drive home from Susan's that I would not yell, because yelling would make me feel temporarily better and ultimately worse, and I had too many things to figure out to spend the night on feelings. "We can get through this," he said. "Maybe," I said. I did not believe it. He slept in the guest room. I lay in our bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about 4 years. I thought about the time I had the flu so badly I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days, and my husband had sat with me and brought me soup and held my hand, and the entire time he was also 4 months into an affair with Amber. I thought about my mother's funeral 2 years ago, and how he had stood beside me at the graveside with his hand at the small of my back, steady and warm, and I had leaned into him and thought, "At least I have this." I thought about all the small moments of a marriage that you hold on to as evidence that it is real, and how I was now re-examining every single one. I called my attorney the next morning. Not my business attorney. A family law attorney named Patricia Hines that Susan had used during her own divorce 8 years earlier and spoken of with something approaching reverence. I sat in Patricia's office 2 days later and laid out the situation plainly. 26 years of marriage, discovery of a 4-year affair, a recently completed business sale. "How much?" Patricia asked. I told her. She wrote it down. Then she looked up. "When did you start the business?" "Itsenjo by Joshisan." "Before the marriage?" 4 years before. I have all the documentation, the original LLC filing, the loan records, every lease, all in my name, all predating the marriage. Patricia set her pen down and folded her hands. Then in Ohio, that's separate property. He has no claim to the sale proceeds. Even if, did he ever have ownership stake? Was he ever listed as a partner or officer? Never. My attorney at the time advised against it. Then no, Patricia said. That money is yours. He can make an argument about marital contribution that his income supported the household while you built the business, but that argument relates to other marital assets, not to the separate property itself. The sale proceeds are not part of the marital estate. I sat very still for a moment. What about the house? That's marital property. That will divide. And his pension? We'll work through all of it. But Margaret, the $3.8 million. That's not on the table. I drove home thinking about the attorney I had barely listened to in 1997 when she sat me down and told me to keep the business in my name. I thought about how advice can sit dormant for 25 years and then become the most important thing anyone ever said to you. When I told my husband I was filing for divorce, he did not take it the way I expected. I think I had braced for remorse. For a continuation of the conversation at the kitchen table, what I got instead, after a very long silence, was a different version of my husband than the one I thought I had known. He became very precise, very careful. He asked about the business sale almost immediately. Whether the money had cleared, whether it was in a joint account. It's in my account, I said. His jaw tightened in a way I recognized from arguments over the years, the expression he made when he felt something had been taken from him. We should talk to a financial advisor together, he said. Before you do anything, I have an attorney. I'm just saying, Margaret, 26 years of marriage? 26 years, I agreed. And 4 of them were a lie. He hired his own attorney 3 days later. I found out through Patricia. Apparently my husband's attorney had made some initial inquiries about the business, its valuation history, whether there were any marital funds that had ever been used for capital improvements, whether we had ever filed joint taxes in a way that indicated shared ownership. Patricia called me on a Thursday afternoon. They're going to argue that marital funds were commingled, that over the years, household income was used to support the business. Can they win that argument? They can make it. It's unlikely to succeed given the documentation you have, but it will lengthen the process. He knows this. His attorney knows this. Right now, I think they're hoping you'll settle quickly rather than fight. I'm not settling, I said. Good, said Patricia. My daughter flew in from Portland the weekend after I told her. She sat on the same couch she had grown up on and listened to everything. And when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, Mom, I need you to know that I saw something at my wedding. She stopped. Started again. There was a woman at the cocktail hour. Dad introduced her as a colleague. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but she looked at him in a way that stayed with me. I should have said something. You had no reason to, I said. You were celebrating your wedding day. I should have said something, she repeated, and I could see the guilt working its way through her, this thing that was not her fault becoming hers to carry. I took her hand. You didn't know, I said. Neither did I. That's on him, not on us. She stayed for 5 days. She helped me go through the house and identify what was mine and what was ours and what I didn't want anymore. She sat with me while I cried because I did cry. Not in his office and not in front of his attorney, but in my own house. In the kitchen I had stood in for 20 years, making lunches and birthday cakes and arguing about nothing. I cried until I was empty, and then I made coffee and got back to the business of dismantling a life that had not been what I thought it was. The divorce proceedings took 8 months. My husband's attorney argued every point they could find: commingling of funds, marital contribution to business growth, the value of the social capital my husband had supposedly provided over the years. I will be honest, when Patricia read that one to me over the phone, I laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. Patricia, to her credit, laughed too. In the end, the sale proceeds remained mine. Entirely. The documentation was too complete, the LLC filings too clean, the paper trail too clear. The judge reviewed everything and found no basis for a claim against my separate property. We divided the house I bought him out, which felt strange and clarifying at the same time, and we divided his pension and the joint savings and the car, And at the end of it, my husband walked out of the courthouse with a settlement that was fair and not a dollar more. And I walked out with my $3.8 million and the quiet, steady feeling of a woman who had built something that no one could take from her. I want to be honest about what the months after the divorce were actually like, because I think stories like this sometimes skip too quickly to the triumphant part, and I owe it to anyone listening to tell the truth. There were mornings when I woke up in the house I had bought him out of and felt the particular weight of a bed that used to hold two people. There were evenings when my daughter called and I was fine. Totally fine, and then I hung up and sat in the kitchen for an hour, not moving. 26 years does not become nothing because it became a lie. The grief and the anger coexist, and neither one waits for the other to finish. I saw a therapist named Dr. Reeves for most of that year. She had an office with too many plants in it and a way of sitting with silence that I found, eventually, more useful than any single thing she said. I told her once about the moment in the parking lot when I cried into my steering wheel before driving to his office, how close I had come to calling my daughter first, to going to Susan's first, to doing anything other than driving straight to him with my news, and she said, "What does it tell you that your first instinct was still him? That I trusted him?" I said. "Yes," she said, "and that's not a character flaw. I am 63 years old now. I have 4 grandchildren and a house that I have repainted twice since the divorce because I can paint it any color I want. My daughter visits every few months and we cook together and talk in the way that mothers and daughters talk when there is nothing left between them that needs to be performed. Last spring, Susan introduced me to a man named Howard at a dinner party. He is 67, a retired high school principal with laugh lines around his eyes and the excellent quality of knowing when to listen. We have had dinner 6 times. He brought flowers to the 5th dinner, and I put them in a vase on the kitchen windowsill and stood there looking at them for a moment, feeling something that I can only describe as surprised. Not by him, by myself. By the fact that this was still possible. The bakeries are someone else's now. The recipes are still mine. Technically, I retained that in the sale, but the buildings and the ovens and the little tables by the windows are being looked after by people I will never meet, and I find that I do not mind. I built those bakeries to build them, not to have them forever. That is a thing I understand about myself now that I did not fully understand before. My attorney, the one from 1997, who sat me down and told me to keep the business in my name, has been retired for 12 years. I looked her up anyway and sent her a note. I told her what had happened, the sale and the divorce, and the long way that her advice had traveled to reach me. I told her that I had listened to her even though I hadn't fully understood why, and that it had made all the difference. She wrote back 2 weeks later, "I always told my clients, protect what you built, not because the people you love aren't trustworthy, but because you deserve to know that what you made is yours, no matter what." I have read that note more times than I can count. I have thought about what it means to build something, really build it, with your hands and your mornings and your refusals to quit and to come out the other side of a life that tried to take it from you and find that it couldn't, that you were more careful than you knew, that you are still here. I put the note in the drawer with the original Marigold's lease, the one I signed in 1993 when I was 29 years old and certain of almost nothing. They sit there together. I don't look at them often, but I know they're there, and sometimes that is enough.